Hello and welcome back to this damn idealistic crusade, all fellow James Bond fans. This video I wanted to make as a sort of my general thoughts on how to do Bond 26 and how to actually get a film generated and actually made and released in a decent amount of time and not have one of the absurd gaps that we've had recently between films. And also, quite frankly, to get the series back on track because we've not had a quote-unquote traditional Bond film, at least since Tomorrow Never Dies. And if you look at the film's structure, we have not had a traditionally structured James Bond film in terms of having a pre-title sequence, then into the M briefing scene, and then into the main story. I mean, really, since A View to a Kill. So it's about time that we actually have something that's a bit more in keeping with the traditional series structure. And I think with the recent era, we've gotten so far away from the actual soul and identity of the James Bond film series that not only is there much more competition in 2023's landscape between different forms of entertainment and different competitors, but you also have the problem of now having to basically remind the audience or the younger audience members or other sections of the audience of what the series is and who the cinematic James Bond is, because we've gotten so far away from the cinematic James Bond identity and heart and soul and all the iconography that if you don't hurry up and remind people of why this is important, you're gonna lose them. And I didn't think we'd be at this point at any time. This is not something that originally crossed my mind when we started into the new millennium after The World Is Not Enough. But here we are in 2023 and in need of really reigniting the stoking the fires of the franchise in order for it to continue. So I have a number of different sort of ideas I've toyed with for years, as all Bond fans do. We all have our sort of what if ideas, but I always try to come up with realistic scenarios and then look at who's around, who's still working, and try to come up with at least, if it were me in charge, I wish it was me in charge, as all Bond fans would say, but I've tried to come up with a sort of at least a realistic proposal to get a Bond 26 put together, actually shot, produced, edited, finished, made, and released within a decent amount of time and not having to spend another absurdly long period of time in between films and losing any sort of momentum. Also, you have to consider Amazon is now a co-owner of the series, and while Eon has always kept MGM and others at bay in the modern era and kind of tried to do their own thing, and they're acting as if they can do that again with Amazon, I don't know if that's exactly going to work out. So there's no real telling what Amazon will try and do with their half ownership of the series and what sort of if they might try to throw their weight around, essentially. Now, to just move through these in a sort of category way, these are just my own general ideas, what ifs, or ideas I thought, or people I thought would be perfect for a long time. And again, trying to make it sort of work in a modern 2023 scenario for a potential Bond 26. And keep in mind, this is all just my own loose sort of thoughts, but just going through by category, the big one, of course, is going to be who will play Bond himself. And this has been my stock answer for years because he's absolutely perfect. He is getting on up there and, he is older now, but age be darned, it's a different world. So we have a lot of older people doing more things than they would have, decades ago. So my answer is still Jason Isaacs for Bond, as the day is long. He is the Bond who has gotten away, and I'm kind of determined to not let that happen if I was somehow in charge. I think he has the range, I think he has the experience for sure, and that's key in Bond. So the idea that they're going to go with young unknowns and always focus on super young actors, I think, is a terrible mistake, because it's almost as if you're saying, hey, 10-year-old kid, you want to play Hamlet on stage? They're obviously not going to have the experience or understand all the nuances or understand the weight of what the role brings, you know. So I think you have to have somebody of experience, and I think Isaacs is absolutely perfect and can pull off all the different elements of Bond with aplomb, but also have his own particular spin on things. So yes, he is, I believe, 60 now, but you know, Roger was 57 for A View to a Kill, and you know, 60 is not quite as up there in age as it used to be considered, and he's still done action films and roles with action in them, so you know, he can definitely handle himself on screen, but I think he would be absolutely perfect. He's just been my choice for years and years, and so in this sort of strike hard and fast scenario of get a film done and out there, I think it could still work. And again, age be darned, because this is my sort of what if scenario. So that's one of the ones that obviously is more of a, it probably wouldn't happen, but wouldn't it be nice if it did, sort of thing. So that's why I've always kept him as my sort of dark horse what if candidate. Now, for the leading lady or Bond girl or Bond woman or whatever term you prefer, I think you need to get a bigger name. And then I think you need to give said actress an actual part to play and some actual scenes that generate the necessary, at least, feeling of romance in a Bond story. That's the whole development of the Bond heroine is something I think if the series had one little thing I could nitpick, or one thing that's always bugged me, is that they usually typically don't go for bigger name actresses, and usually the Bond woman character or the Bond girl is kind of more of a secondary figure, and of course you've got a film runtime and it's focused on our main character, but they've never been able to fully replicate the sense that you get from Ian Fleming's heroines of his original novels, and you actually care about all of those characters, and it's never quite had that same that same sort of direct connection between audience and character in the films, with a few exceptions. And that's why, you know, casting Diana Rigg in On Her Majesty's Secret Service was such a big thing, and why they knew it was necessary to get a really good actress to sell the part of Countess Tracy DiVincenzo. So you need somebody who can do that, and I think a perfect choice would be Emily Blunt. She has the ability to do action sequences, but she can also do humor, she can do dramatic scenes, and I think she would fit perfectly in the Bond universe, particularly if you're focusing on actually upping the sensuality of the characters once more. That's something that's definitely gotten lost over time, and that's something I feel is really unique to the Terrence Young Bond films, and that's part of the Bond cocktail that got the films going and what people responded to. Not sex or sex scenes, but the sensuality of the scenes. There's a reason why the bedroom scene in From Russia with Love is still the test scene used to screen test James Bond actors. And what makes that scene work is the unspoken sensuality between Bond and Tatiana Romanova, and that's why that is the quote-unquote the steamiest scene in the entire series, and that's all Terrence Young, and that's a particular quality that is not in any other films in the series outside of the three films he directed. That's why they have that unique flavor to them. And the sensuality only adds to the whole danger quotient of the Terrence Young films, which again is a key part of the James Bond cinematic cocktail that has been greatly diluted, if not removed, over time. And no one else has ever gotten those elements to the same level. And I think having a real heavy hitter actress in there who can actually carry off all the aspects of a Bond heroine, just like an actual Fleming heroine from the novels, and really giving her a character that's a bit beefed up and has more going on and more things to play, I think it will only serve to make the whole film stronger. And if I had to sort of give an approach or a particular character that I think Emily Blunt would be great at, I think the perfect choice would be Gala Brand, actually doing Fleming's Gala Brand from the Moonraker novel. And yes, they kind of touched on that with Miranda Frost and Die Another Day, but not really, because Gillibrand isn't an a so-called ice queen, but she is a rather interesting character, and I think that would be a great setup to see the lead Bond girl be in a Bond film. We've gotten, again, sort of versions of it. They've sort of hit around it, but I just think it would be really great to see Fleming's character actually hit the screen and actually have her actual name and actually have Gillibrand in a Bond film. So that's the sort of lineup I have in my head. Again, that's just if I had to sort of give a general direction. Now, in terms of villain, this is where I can just open the floodgates, because I have just a short list of all the various ideas I've had over the years, but you need a real legend or heavy hitter or somebody who can just really sell every scene. So on my short list, and you could go with any of these, and some of them are definite what-if scenarios, but my short list, of course, includes Malcolm McDowell, Terrence Stamp. If you could convince Daniel Day-Lewis to come out of retirement and play a Bond villain, because what greater challenge could there be for an actor, if I'm honest? Brian Cox would make a phenomenal Bond villain, and of course he's now had his big splash in Succession, so that would be somebody that would get a lot of modern audience members excited. You could go with Sir Ben Kingsley, who would be a phenomenal Bond villain. Of course, you could also go with Sir Anthony Hopkins, who we almost got in the Brosnan era. He was almost in, well, actually, I guess technically was in Tomorrow Never Dies, but wound up dropping out due to the whole production mess of that film. So we could get him to actually come and finally play a Bond villain. And then another sort of interesting, deeper cut, lesser discussed choice, I think, who I think could do a really great job, is Henry Czerny, who is best known probably for playing Kittredge in the Mission Impossible series. And just imagining what he would do with the one-on-one Bond villain discussing with Bond scenes, particularly if you give the Bond villain a certain mania or a certain goal that gets him all hot and bothered. I think that would lead to just some interesting, wonderful, dramatic fireworks. So the Bond villain field is wide open, but those are just some names that I think would make for outstanding Bond villains. There is one character, though, who has been always underutilized and could, if well written and actually given something to do that is of substance, I think there is the absolute, this person was born to play this character choice out there, and it boggles my mind that so few people conceive or see of this. And if they actually do something with Felix Leiter that is actually worthy of the character, and they don't just have him as a sort of secondary throwaway, you need to actually give him something to do so he has an actual presence in the story. But if you have Felix Leiter in the film, you have to have him played by Matthew McConaughey, because who better in the world to play a cynical, sandy-haired Texan with a mischievous sense of humor and a love of good drink and good food, you know? I mean, it writes itself. I mean, he already embodies so much of Fleming's Felix Leiter, it's not even funny. So sometimes there are certain roles that simply cast themselves, and I just can't get the image out of my head of Matthew McConaughey talking to whoever your Bond actor is, and just using the phrase "you limey bastard" with a sort of mischievous grin. Just it feels so absolutely perfect. So that is. If I have a casting no-brainer, if I have a casting 100% lock, this person was born to play this role, it is Matthew McConaughey playing Felix Leiter. Now, moving on to what I think is actually the single most important factor is who the heck is going to write the darn thing? Because the first thing that should be done is Purvis and Wade have been around for too long. They've been kept around for some strange reason or to rewrite other people. And there really needs to be a change up, because I don't think they've really helped the series along in the ways that they should have, and I don't see why they've been kept around for so long. So I think the writing has been the biggest problem over the years. And I know Purvis and Wade haven't been able to do their original screenplays and concepts 100%, so I don't think it's entirely their fault. But I do think they've been kept around far too long, and we do need fresh blood in who also understands the James Bond character and the James Bond film series. And it might serve to actually have a sort of, I mean, maybe not quite a television approach, but to have a sort of actual writer's room, or at least have a bunch of people in to throw ideas around to start things with. And the Bond films usually, they always do some form of this. Everybody contributes ideas, and they have various meetings with inside Eon, and everybody's throwing ideas around or vetoing other ideas. But they usually don't go in and bring in a lot of real Bond experts and professionals. They did do a big bring a bunch of people in because we need ideas and we're kind of desperate sort of summit meeting to start Tomorrow Never Dies. And that's where you got Nicholas Meyer being brought in, and where he came up with his sort of radical Bond works with the villain for a while, because the villain has this plot based on combating overpopulation by, I believe it was essentially by trying to wipe off a lot of people off the face of the planet, because he was so motivated by fears of overpopulation. Meyer was trying to come up with sort of some out-of-the-box ideas to sort of shake things up a little bit and have give Bond in a film something a bit different, give audiences something a bit different. That was thrown out and rejected, but I do think that the sort of kernel of his idea, the overpopulation plot, is good and solid, and we've only seen somebody really do that in Bond, sort of in a sideways kind of way, because Meyer thought it had not been used before. It was just diluted out of the film, because that was actually Drax's motivation in the Moonraker film, and it's still in Christopher Wood's novelization, but all those elements kind of got dialed out or removed entirely from the film, and so you don't exactly know why Drax has his floating stud farm in space, except his mad scheme is to essentially make himself a new god of sorts. Well, originally it was all inspired by Drax being afraid of overpopulation, so there was a sort of background to it, just like Stromberg in The Spy Who Loved Me being afraid of mankind destroying itself. So that could be a great potential starting point, or the way you get your sort of MacGuffin of the film, because I don't envy any Bond writer, because the single hardest thing in the world is to come up with a great Bond plot and a villain scheme that is not only original and fresh and Bondian, but also hasn't been done before, and hasn't been done before by somebody else, because there's so much other competition. So I struggle to even come up with the plot approach or a plot idea for a what-if scenario. So again, I don't envy anyone in that. So I just tried to come up with a few sort of maybe jumping off points. Another idea, or getting back to talking about sort of having a writer's room or bringing in some real Bond professionals, it's about darn time that Eon actually starts utilizing the massive amount of material in the continuation novels. They did finally officially take a part of Colonel Sun and use it at the end of Spectre, although very watered down and quite badly, I'd argue. So much so that you didn't quite recognize what it was at first, until something was in the back of your brain going, hey, wait a minute, this seems familiar, and then slowly you start to realize it's actually the torture sequence from Colonel Sun. And Eon has also unofficially, at least seemingly, been heavily inspired by some of the continuation novels at different points, even in the 1980s, and using elements from the John Gardner books. But they should actively embrace them and actually start officially pulling more elements, because you've got a whole wealth of material to work from of new unused ideas. And I think the best way to do this would be to bring on some of those writers, at least in some sort of creative capacity, to, if not write the screenplay, at least get the ball rolling and develop the story. And I think two great people who would be perfect and should be involved in some way are Raymond Benson and Charlie Higson, who I think are the two best modern writers writers of Bond continuation materials. Maybe bring in Anthony Horowitz as well, who's come up with a lot of different spy plots or spy-themed plots in his writings, and now also his James Bond continuation works as well. So there's three people right there that I think would make a phenomenal writer's room, if you will, to develop the story. Whether or not they would go on to write the screenplay, I'm not sure. But if we're talking about actually bringing in a real screenwriter to then do the final screenplay or also help to develop the story, I think there is. I was trying to come up with a good name, somebody who I think could really understand Bond, is old enough to know what Bond is, who Bond is, and what the Bond series means, and in terms of the legacy and the longevity and the overall approach and the wide-ranging interests of the Bond series. But also somebody who has a very strong sense of narrative, story drive, and development, and has experience writing for bigger action and adventure type films, someone who has a good history of strong narrative storytelling, which is something that Bond absolutely needs as the foundation, because without that, you're all over the place. And ever since Richard Maybaum's passing, I think the Bond series has just been going all over the place. And once they lost his strong sense of story construction, that was like pulling the rug out from under everything. And it suddenly occurred to me, somebody who could do all of these things and is very underrated and still working, still around right now. And it just got stuck in my head, and I'm like, I just want to see what they would do, because I think they could write one hell of a Bond script, because this person also has that spark of energy and that spark of wildness in terms of being able to get that sort of that indefinable magical spark that's in the Bond series, particularly in the original films, and getting that Bond cocktail just right. And that's Sam Hamm, writer most famously of the first Batman film, Batman '89, and of course, before it was rewritten slightly by Warren Scarron. Sam Hamm also famously wrote the version of Watchmen that was going to probably be made by Terry Gilliam back in the day, and he was the one person who figured out how to at least get a workable screenplay out of the very difficult to adapt Watchmen. And when you read sort of elements of what that was and his approach, it actually makes sense. And actually, it's kind of a shame we didn't get that film. And again, it has that what I alluded to before, and what we love in Batman '89, the strong sense of story construction at your core, and then allowing your characters sort of play around in that and develop the character arcs over the course of the film, and never losing sight of the fact of what these films are supposed to be, and having the necessary action beats and that additional sort of sparkle of a little bit of whimsy, a little bit of just not over the top, but that indefinable quality that makes the films have that slate edge of, okay, there's a little bit of magic here. This is out of the ordinary. This is what you come to a movie for. That sort of escapism. So you need a good degree of that in every Bond story. And I'm just ultra curious. Ever since the idea occurred to me, I'm like, what would it be like if Sam Hamm wrote a Bond movie? So that just appeals to me so much. And I don't know what it is about me thinking of Batman writers to try their hand at doing Bond, because if I had other suggestions, it actually would actually be people who have written for Batman before, and or even seeing what Paul Dini and Alan Burnett would come up with, because Batman the Animated Series has some is filled with Bond parallels and allusions and nods, and they even did their own Moonraker episode essentially. Well, I guess technically it's like a slight mashup of Spy and Moonraker, and it's a beautiful Batman story. But I think that would be an interesting sort of approach to bring in people with background in similar material dealing with a long-running character with a particular series focus, but it gives them, they have that outside perspective, but they understand how to write for a series long running character with particular set parameters and having to keep it fresh while building on the pre-existing lore. I think that would be a very interesting sort of, here's people who can do the job and they have that outside perspective and they have an interest and they know and love the character already. So that's just, I think, why I keep gravitating towards Batman writers for Bond. And then lastly, about the writing, if whether you use the overpopulation idea that Nicholas Meyer had or not, trying to come up with like a sort of jumping off point or a story basis for the sort of feel of what this film could be. They shouldn't be afraid to do a smaller scale story if that's what it calls for, because sometimes it's good to, as in For Your Eyes Only, to come back down to earth, have a more focused, harder hitting story that isn't, you know, a big gigantic film where we're going all over the world and the budget is massive, you know. So it's a good thing sometimes to have a smaller, more focused film, and it might be better to do that in this instance because, again, you have that factor of having to sort of reinvigorate the series and remind people of what Bond films are and get them reinvested again. So it's not always the scale and the scope of the film or the story that matters. It's always the effectiveness of it. They shouldn't be afraid, or Eon shouldn't be afraid to make a smaller scale story. But two potential ideas as a sort of basis or jumping off point, if we're pulling more from the continuation novels and we're reestablishing Bond, an easy sort of framework jumping off point might be to maybe utilize some of John Gardner's first Bond novel, License Renewed, which is all about getting the Bond character going again. And there's some elements there that could serve as a nice sort of foundation for a first act or jumping off point for a Bond film. The other, and the easiest, I think, suggestion, it would be for a direct adaptation or at least the basis of a film, is to take what I think is Raymond Benson's best Bond novel, High Time to Kill, and adapt that into an actual Bond film, because for all intents and purposes, when you read that, it's literally a Bond film in a book. That is, I think it's probably the best of all the modern continuation novels. I think it's very underrated, and it has a particular atmosphere and setting that we have not seen in a Bond film, and a good plot, a good MacGuffin, and everything in that book works, and it works beautifully, and you can actually envision the film in your head as you read it. So turning that book into a screenplay and thus a Bond film, I think, would be actually the easiest thing to do, because the work's already pretty much done for you. It would just be a more difficult film to make due to the book's setting, which actually has, a Bond trying to basically there's a race for the MacGuffin across trying to summit the mountain Kanchunga. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, which is, of course, in the Himalayas just next to Everest and one of the most treacherous mountains to climb in the world. So again, not something we've seen in a Bond film before, plenty of interesting elements, and again, it's already pretty much a Bond film in novel form. So I think those would be two very good, solid approaches to take as sort of jumping off points if you're going to actually use particular continuation novel plots or ideas. Then we move on to director, and this is something that gets bandied about a lot. The current going thing now, and what's been going around for years, is that Christopher Nolan should direct a Bond film, and I think that's probably the worst possible choice. Everybody always gravitates towards bigger names, and if you look at Bond films, the best directors would be more considered journeyman directors, which is not something that unfortunately exists anymore. But when you go for a big name like Christopher Nolan now, he has a particular style. I think that kind of runs opposite of what a Bond film should be, because a Bond film really needs a tight focus on story. It needs a tight runtime, particularly if you can get it under 2 hours. That's the, I think, part of the magic of the Bond formula. And when you're going after a big name, obviously Christopher Nolan would come in, and either you're going to try and manage him and force a square peg into a round hole and lose all the elements of his style, or he's going to fight you, or you're going to just let him do his thing, and then basically that kind of means he does his own thing, and thus it's not really a Bond film. a Christopher Nolan thing, and that's not a Bond film. They're two different things. So you have to have somebody who doesn't bring their, oh, I have my style and this is what I do and I always do my own thing. You have to have somebody who can understand what a Bond film is and work their style into the Bond film experience. And they have to mesh and go hand in hand. And that's why the series has worked best in the past with people who are considered more journeyman type directors. Now, in terms of who's still around and who could actually pull that off pretty well, I basically have three main choices. I think the best overall is actually Philip Noyce, who did two of the 90s Jack Ryan films. He did the 1997 version of The Saint. He did the spy thriller Salt, which I think was back in, 2010. So he has the experience in terms of doing series films. He has done spy films. He can do a big, large budget action film with a lot of location work all over the world. And he also serves the story of what he's telling. He doesn't have an overbearing style, and he's also obviously not a giant name, but also very underrated. I think he directed one of the best films of this century, the criminally underappreciated and underseen adaptation of Graham Greene's The Quiet American, which Michael Caine should have won an Oscar for. It's one of his career best performances. So this is Noyce is somebody who can do intensive drama, great, well done, well helmed action sequences, and he's still working today, and he has the experience of series films in the completely analog pre-digital realm. So he has his foot he has a foot in either filmmaking ways of the past and modern filmmaking, because he's managed to keep going. And I think he's actually got a film coming out this year, actually with Pierce Brosnan. He has worked with other Bond actors and Bond team members and professionals. And I think of everybody working today, everybody who's still around, everybody who has the proper resume and has that necessary experience, I think he's probably the best overall choice, because you also need somebody with experience who can give the requisite energy and give the film the kick in the pants it needs every once in a while. That's what Martin Campbell brought. And, you also need somebody who can, put their voice in, and when Eon wants to go a particular way, you need somebody who says no. You need somebody who actually is that sort of that factor of reason, and that sort of pushback against some of the crazier ideas that Eon has had and has tried to move the series into, that doesn't really gel with the Bond formula or Bond cinematic identity. And I think Philip Noyce would be able to do that very well. I'd love to see what he would do with a Bond film. And once this idea kind of popped in my head, I think he's the person that makes the most sense, and he's still working today and has the requisite experience. Now, if I had a sort of wild card choice of somebody who could really knock it out of the park, but there's probably not much of a chance that they would actually consider him or hire him, is somebody whose name gets thrown around a lot, but after what happened in his personal life, he's not directed a film in a great number of years. So my sort of wildcard choice would be John McTiernan, who of course is most famous for Die Hard, Predator, and I think his masterpiece, The Hunt for Red October, which is one of the best films of the 90s and started the Jack Ryan series that then Philip Noyce came in and took over the second and third films. So again, going to the 90s Jack Ryan series to try and pull for a director. McTiernan, of course, has the perfect resume. He has the experience. He can do the action. He can do the character. He can do the humor. He can do that sort of lightness of touch and bring that energy in. But also he can do a thinking man's thriller, because you have Hunt for Red October. And I think that is something that Bond needs to get back to, or at least get that element back in there, because you need a strong plot and you need a director who can drive along a strong plot and blend the action and the exotic with a thinking man's spy thriller plot, which is what Fleming always did. So I do think McTiernan could do a great Bond film, but unfortunately he's basically the wild card sort of choice at this point. And I don't think, unfortunately, anybody's going to be hiring him anytime soon. But he's also very hungry to make a film, and you can tell that when he does interviews and things. So when I was thinking about Philip Noyce, then McTiernan flashed through my brain, and then I'm like, well, heck, why did I not think of that before? So McTiernan is pretty much my sort of wild card choice in terms of somebody they're probably never going to choose, but could do the job extremely well. Then the other and probably the safest choice is, of course, Ridley Scott, who has been bandied about a few times before. He does have his own style. He would come in and, obviously bring his style with him, but he also knows how to serve story in addition to giving you great visuals. And I think obviously Scott would be somebody who would understand what the James Bond film series was and the series identity, and somebody who would bring the requisite energy and get into back and forth discussions with Eon and actually get the film done and made, because he has, had an impressive number of films he's been continuing to do in keeping his career going. So this would mean you'd actually have a bigger name director who's still working today, actually, getting some cachet to the overall production. And I think he could do well. Probably not the 100% best fit for a Bond film, and he obviously would bring elements of his style in, which could possibly overwhelm the Bond film identity a bit. But I do think he would keep some of that in check and try and give a actual Bond feeling experience. So I think Scott would be the safest choice and a rather obvious choice, but he would definitely bring his own style in and probably put his own spin on it. But I do think if you needed a bigger name director to help sell the film and get interest in the production, I think Scott would be the safest choice. And then as a brief sort of fourth person to throw their hat in the ring, there's me. I'm always available, guys. I just have to throw my own hat in the ring there. And then lastly, I think you have to also focus on who the cameraman is going to be. And of course, the director has a lot of say in that, will probably want their own people. But since I'm sort of dream casting or picking random individuals already, in terms of cinematographer, there you have to look at who's still around, and some people are retired by now, so I don't think Phil Mayhew will come back anytime soon, because I think he's pretty much retired. So I think of people who are still working and who also have film experience, and then even looking for people who have previously shot a Bond film. I think the probably the best overall choice is Robert Elswit, who of course shot Tomorrow Never Dies. He shot other notable modern films like There Will Be Blood, and then came over to the Mission Impossible series and shot both Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation. So you've got somebody with the perfect previous experience. He shot a Bond film. He knows how to shoot film. He knows how to go for the sort of high gloss, larger than life look. He knows how to approach a Bond film, and he's still working today. So I think that's why Elswit is probably the best overall choice. And he's also been doing other action and adventure franchises and did the 2 MI films in the intervening years. So I think him coming back to the fold and shooting another Bond film would be a very easy and obvious choice. Because my next point is this is another way to sell the film and to help differentiate and make people understand why Bond is special again. I think a Bond film should always be shot on film, and I think it would help to actually edit it on film as well, and thus be the first film since GoldenEye to actually be made entirely by hand and not to be cut digitally either. I think that would be an interesting thing to try, and also a way to help sell the film, because then you could also go the route of, since other entities have sold their films on their stuntmanship and the set pieces like Bond films used to be in the 70s and 80s particularly, I think Bond films should not have any CGI usage whatsoever, and I think that is an important distinction to make, and that will also help sell the Bond films as the the sort of king of the genre, the original, the series that is always imitated, and to also give across that feeling of quality craftsmanship again. So the Bond films were always they always prided themselves on the stunt work and the real locations and putting the money on the screen. And I think the best way to do that in this day and age and to really draw an audience in and impress them is not only to do the set pieces and action sequences and the globe trotting and shooting on film and cutting on film, but to do everything practically and to make a real Bond film without any CGI usage whatsoever. And that also sends a clear message that, okay, we're going for broke and we're actually going to do this and we're going to do it the right way and we're not half-assing it in any way. That doesn't mean you need a gigantic budget. I think modern film budgets for bigger films have gotten way out of control, and if your focus is putting all the money on the screen, as Bond films used to do, you don't need a gargantuan budget. If you look at what Bond films cost, even compared to other films at that time, and where the money was allocated, they were priced and budgeted very well, and especially the films in the 80s where they were unfortunately pretty much sort of budget capped. So you don't need a gargantuan budget even if you're completely not using CGI at all, because if you look at the recent budgets for the last couple of films that Eon has produced, they are, I think, way too gargantuan. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean you need the greatest budget in the world. Two other important key elements, if you can get to an under 2-hour runtime, I think that's absolutely essential. The editing needs to be well done and tightly done, and keeping to the sort of Peter Hunt doctrine of who established the pulse of the series. And 2 hours 10 minutes, 2 hours 15 minutes tops is pushing it, but if you can get it to 2 hours, especially under 2 hours, I think that is absolutely perfect, and something that needs to happen again. Having a nearly 3-hour supposed Bond film is insanity, I think, and no Bond film should ever be that long. There's no reason for it. It really runs contrary to the series and the series identity and the type of stories that the series is supposed to be telling. So again, if you can get to around a 2-hour runtime, that's really what the target should be. Another thing is, of course, the gun barrel has to actually be at the front, because the gun barrel is the signifier of the Bond film experience, and without a proper, actual, real gun barrel done with full gusto and spirit, it's not really a Bond film. That's a key part of what the Bond film is. That's the visual signifier of the start of a James Bond film for everyone in the audience, and to not have that on there, or to do it half-assed, means you're not starting off on the right foot, and it's something that needs to be there, and it needs to be done properly. As for who would edit the film, I honestly don't quite know. I would love to be able to see Paul Hirsch edit a Bond film, one of the film industry's legendary greatest editors, who I believe is, I guess, retired now. But if he did perhaps come out of retirement to cut a Bond film, I think that would be absolutely magical. But you would need somebody of Paul Hirsch's stature to cut a Bond film, because it is, I think, one of film editing's greatest challenges, and I don't think the series has ever recovered from losing Peter Hunt in the editing room, because his work was so groundbreaking that it practically influenced the entire film industry and caused a sort of seismic shift in the way films were edited. So you need the best editor you can possibly get to cut a Bond film. Then moving on to who would do the score. I think the most interesting choice and the biggest name you could go for would be John Williams, who has actually expressed desire to do a James Bond film score, and it would be interesting to see what he would do with it, particularly if he could get back to some of his early scores that had more of a darker tinge jazz flavor to them in some areas, which of course is really part of the core of the John Barry style that developed. You need a score that can reflect Bond's identity and his thought processes. You need a Bond score that's also identifiable and unique and enjoyable and memorable, and I don't think there's been a very good Bond score in decades, actually, and I think the scores have been really either completely forgettable or downright terrible, if I'm honest, in the modern films, and none of them have the requisite Bond flavor or are memorable at all, I'd argue. So you really need someone who can do the best score for the film that's humanly possible, and I think they should really try and go for at least a bigger name composer or somebody who would really swing for the fences and really try to make a great Bond score. So I think John Williams would be an interesting and probably the biggest name choice you could go for. The most obvious choice would be to bring back David Arnold, who could definitely do another very good Bond score and perhaps take a different approach or have a different sort of styled approach this time, because there's been a great number of years since he last worked on the series, and he does have the background of his previous Bond scores, so he certainly has the experience. So he's probably the easiest and most obvious choice, and definitely should come back at some point and do another score for the series. Other potential alternates might be perhaps Danny Elfman or maybe even Graham Revell. It just springs to mind, but there's at least a handful of composers that I think could do good work. In terms of doing the title song, I think the easiest and most obvious choice would be Depeche Mode. I think they should have done a Bond song years ago, and if you were going for somebody today who should do a Bond song, who has the requisite flavor already and who has that sort of legendary status, and getting somebody really with that musical legacy to come in and do a fantastic Bond song, I think Depeche Mode is a perfect choice. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say in this is that Bond 26 needs to be released in a way that is basically Eon and everyone involved sort of throwing down the gauntlet of just coming in, striking hard and fast to give the audience a great Bond film experience. And also, you really have to remind people of why Bond is so special, what the Bond cinematic identity is. You have to recapture the audience's imagination. You have to recapture the spirit of adventure. You also have to get the audience excited again. You have to get the audience to be so invested in the film that it re-energizes their fandom or their interest. And you have to also strike back against all of the competition, particularly the Mission Impossible franchise that has been stealing a lot of Bond's thunder for a good number of years now, and actually earning audience goodwill in ways that Eon has not, and they've kind of let them do this. And of course, the MI films have been also releasing more films in less time and beating Bond at the box office many times. So this needs to be an attempt to sort of reclaim the throne, really. That's what it is. You have to ultimately, with Bond 26, the number one goal has to be, you have to remind the audience, you have to remind the world at large that, to borrow the tagline from GoldenEye, there is no substitute. That's what the goal and the whole aim of Bond 26 has to be. This is what Cubby Broccoli had to focus on in doing with The Spy Who Loved Me, re-energizing the franchise as a solo producer and betting the farm on that one film. That's what had to happen on GoldenEye, and that's what needs to happen again. And you do need to establish the series as a continual releasing entity again. And that means not having massive gaps between films. That means getting the ball rolling with Bond 26 and keeping it rolling, not letting it stagnate, not letting Bond slip away from the public consciousness, and not letting others come in and continually not only create competition, but also steal some of Bond's thunder. It's time to remind people of the magic of a Bond film experience and get people reinvigorated and get people reinvested in the James Bond film series. So these have just been my sort of general thoughts and what I think Bond 26 needs to do, but also a sort of proposal of some various names and ideas to get the ball rolling and to actually get a Bond 26 film in production, made, released, and done so in a more timely fashion, to not have this sort of
well, everything's kind of up in the air. We don't know what we're doing. We'll maybe get something released in the next 5 years. That's not the way to go. That doesn't help anybody. And you also have to recapture audience interest in this ever competitive entertainment world. So essentially, you need to get the film moving and actually get a good, well made, quality film out, and then strike while the iron is hot and get another film in production. You need to get the series moving again, and you need to get that principle in audiences' heads to know that they're not going to have to wait 3 to 5 years for some bloated gargantuan thing to come out that it really does not look or sound anything like a James Bond film. You have to recapture the spirit of the series and then actually make quality films on a decent sort of timetable and keep your audience invested. So it's not just getting Bond 26 done, it's also striking while the iron's hot and keeping the ball rolling. So, as always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond and films have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, these are just my own sort of open ended thoughts and what ifs and dream casting ideas and different things. So, I figured I would put them out in video form to finally get them out of, rolling around in my head all the time. So, please do keep enjoying the world of James Bond, rewatching the films, diving into the literary Bond, and as always, keep bonding, and thank you ever so much for watching.